we will have a multidisciplinary case discussion. For this, first I will introduce the panelists for the day. From left to right, I have my colleague Dr. Sri Krishnan from the Department of Emergency Medicine, our beloved V. Pillai sir, myself Dr. Chandresh, Dr. Girish sir, and Dr. Dhanasekaran sir. So we have experts from the disciplines of emergency medicine, toxicology and anesthesiology. We will start with the case. Dr. Krishna will be introducing the case. Over to Dr. Krishna.
So this was briefly some days back. We have a 17-year-old boy who was brought by his mother to the emergency department, claiming that he is unable to open his eyes and is unable to speak. That was a brief history that we got. So we just went ahead and asked a little bit more about what exactly happened regarding that. The boy was quite well. His vacation was going on, so he was playing football till last evening, and he went to his bed and he was okay. He had his dinner, everything. And next day, early morning, when the mother was trying to wake him up, he is unable to speak and he is unable to open his eyes. That was a brief history that we got. From that, he was taken to a nearby local hospital where they did a brief clinical examination and basic first aid was given to him from there. And they had a suspicion of an acute facet paralysis, a Guillain-Barré syndrome or a tick paralysis or something like that, and botulinum toxin, and he was referred to us for further management. This was the brief history that we got from the mother. So when the patient arrived to the emergency department, actually it was only a departmental celebration was actually going on. So everybody was there in the department. All our colleagues were in the department. So we just brought in the patient. So when we examined him, when we standard assessment of airway, breathing, circulation and disability assessment, his airway, that was the most important thing as we consider as an emergency physician. His airway is actually, it was not patent. There was a lot of pooling of secretions. He was unable to speak. He was trying to tell something, but it is not very clear. He was trying to phonate. That was the situation. So briefly, immediately, as a measure to secure the airway, we went ahead with positioning of the airway and starting the clearing of the secretions, and we started on an high flow oxygen. That was the initial step that we did. So airway was stabilized with that, and then we went ahead with the breathing. And breathing, when we checked, there was no much respiratory involvement. Muscle involvement was not seen much, but there was some chest rise. And it was bilaterally symmetrical, but it was not adequate, and his oxygen saturation was around 80% on room air. So after supplementation, his oxygen saturation improved to 95%, and meanwhile we decided that we need to secure his airway and breathing. So there is some problem with the airway and breathing. So we were not very sure what happened to him. Maybe a sudden history like this. Usually the classical Guillain-Barré syndrome, we will have an proximal distal muscle weakness slowly progressing to upwards, and then the patient will present to us. Then we were thinking why this patient is having this sort of presentation, and meanwhile we decided to intubate this patient. So we intubated him, and few of my colleagues went again to the mother, and they were very curious regarding what is happening to him. So we again went back to him, and we were repeatedly asking the history, what exactly happened. And out of the box, we just thought, we were thinking all the reasons for an acute facet paralysis, where the bottom line, we have a neurotoxic snake bite. So we just, out of the curiosity, one of my colleagues asked, can you just go to house and just check in the surroundings, whether you can find something like a snake or something, so that we can get a clue of what happened to him exactly. So meanwhile, the patient was secured with an airway, we intubated with him an 8-size CT2 in view of a bulbar palsy and with an early aspiration. We went ahead with an intubation, and later on his airway was secured and breathing, and after the intubation he was stable. And there was no issue with his heart rate or blood pressure. His hemodynamics was okay. Only problem what we initially had was his A and B. Then coming to circulation, as I told, it was his pulse rate and heart rate, pulse rate and as well as the blood pressure was okay. And following by disability assessment, again his DCS was like he was unable to open his eyes. It was E1, and he was moving his limbs. That is another thing. He was moving his limbs, and but he is unable to phonate. That was the history that we got. So meanwhile, few of his colleagues ringed up his house and asked to check something is around. We found out that there is still a live snake lying down near his bed where he was sleeping last night, and snake identified was crate. So that is the thing. When we again examined him, we didn't find any of the fan marks. There was nothing over his body, but he had a classical bulbar palsy and a facial nerve and cranial nerve weakness. That's how he presented to us. So after the intubation and after the resuscitation, maybe half an hour later only, we came to know regarding this history. Then after that we went and we started to decided that okay, if this patient needs ASP and a standard anti-snake venom protocol with neostigmine was started for him. This is what briefly happened. Because as we know, Guillain-Barré syndrome sort of a presentation, acute facet presentation, is very common to have in an emergency department, and it is very rare to get a crate bite coming to an ED with an AFP. So that is a brief history.
So two key messages are: one, definitely to suspect a crate bite from a presentation like this, and second thing, a very classical kind of teaching that you have to go back and get the history also properly from the labels, right?
Yes.
So I'll start off with Professor. So in such a situation, what are the differential diagnoses we need to think of purely from a bite perspective and also from a toxicological perspective? Your inputs on that?
As far as toxicology is concerned, no doubt I will say, Dr. Sri Krishnan said that he had the differential diagnosis of snake bite right at the bottom. Maybe as a toxicologist, I would like to have that higher up. Maybe somewhere here, 1 to 3 snake bite, the manifestations like this. And then we all know in India, crate is such a common snake. Maybe not all that common in Kerala, but most parts of the country. And a presentation like this is actually more or less classic, where somebody has been bitten and we don't know for sure, fang mark is not very clear and things like that, but he's presenting with neurological manifestations, especially paralysis. I think doctors in India will have to push possibility of snake bite in the differential diagnosis right up, maybe 1 to 3 somewhere. Aside from that, in Kerala, certainly we have to think of also neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, whether he had some meal, because this happened in the night, dinner time, what food he took. And we should also consider maybe botulism, things like that. From the toxicological perspective, these are the things that will spring to my mind.
But again, the absence of a bite mark and crates, if you can just elaborate on that point.
Yes.
Why is it,
Crate is notorious for causing very minimal kinds of local signs. Sometimes fang mark may not be evident, sometimes fang mark may be present in some part of the body which is least expected. Like there is a case I remember, reading as well as hearing about it in a presentation by Dr. Bavaskar, who is a noted, worker in the field of snake bite envenomation, where a small girl was brought, similar, kind of clinical picture, paralysis at night, which was, become very severe towards the morning, and she was taken to the hospital. Nobody could initially find out the reason why she got paralyzed like that. And then careful search from head to toe revealed a fang mark, single puncture wound behind the ear. She was bitten there, and it was subsequently proved that it was crate bite. So crates, we have to always be, clear in our mind that local manifestations may not be clear. If there is a mere suspicion, I think we should take it as possible crate bite and start antivenom, see whether there is any improvement or not. If there is, it's almost confirmation. If there is no improvement, we can, consider other etiologies later.
We will move on to some clinical aspects also. Sir, here we are dealing with more like a neurotoxic envenomation kind of thing. Can you elaborate on the neostigmine test and what are how we do it?
Before going to neostigmine, Saras told some differential diagnosis. One important differential diagnosis from an emergency physician's point of view is hypokalemic paralysis. It's something similar to any type of snake bite. Patient will be fully conscious, patient will have all features, sudden onset. Then Miller-Fisher variant of GBS. Then, like sir told, botulism, tick paralysis. All these things present same, but since, like sir told, now snake bite, Dr. Suresh has told it is in the bottom line, but we have to keep at least in third place. Hypokalemia is one of the common presentation I have seen in emergency room with acute paralysis. That is the commonest thing. But snake bite in our country, it is very, very common. So we have to suspect that, like sir told, crate may not have the bite mark. When you neostigmine, this patient is intubated. So it is. There are a lot of views on like these symptoms, like a patient who is having neurological paralysis. Once you intubate and ventilate the patient itself, patient is going to improve. But suppose we don't have that facility or we want to improve fast, we have to avoid ventilation, then neostigmine is a very good choice. But before giving neostigmine, either we should have atropine loaded or we have to give atropine before. Normally, emergency physicians will give atropine before and give neostigmine, and we can see the improvement in patients. But there are multiple views on neostigmine. Some doctors may not prefer neostigmine, but standard guidelines says when you have a neurological bite, you have to try neostigmine because we can avoid ventilation. See, ventilation is proven that in snake bite, neurological bite, ventilation alone is enough to save the patient. But as an emergency physician or a critical care doctor, we have to avoid ventilation because that is going to create other problems like aspiration pneumonia, so many other complaints. So neostigmine is definitely useful. We have to give atropine before, or we should have loaded atropine with us to avoid the complication of neostigmine. Suppose we know that this is a clear-cut snake bite poison before itself, we could have given neostigmine and sometimes we will be able to avoid the ventilation. But here we didn't get any clue initial phase. That was the problem.
Right. Again, in this case, we went ahead and intubated the patient. Sir, what are the key things which we need to keep in mind while we are intubating or going ahead with ventilation of a snake bite? Please.
Okay, when we receive patients like this,
Sir.
and now we are suspecting mostly in terms of the crite, which is a neurotoxic.
Sir.
So we have to go step by step from ABC. Regarding the airway,
Sir.
since it may be having lot of secretions because the bulbar palsy, he cannot able to swallow, gag reflexes may be absent, then it may be causing airway obstruction partially as well as it may cause aspiration chances also. Then we have to open the airway, then we have to. So sometimes this poison, neurotoxic poison itself may cause pterygoid muscle paralysis, so they cannot able to open the mouth. So we very difficult to clear the airway as well as maintain the airway. In such cases, we have to think of going for it. Apart from the maneuvers, think of oropharyngeal or nasopharyngeal airway. Because here the bleeding, hematotoxicity is excluded, so we can better go for nasopharyngeal airway in case they cannot be able to open the mouth. If they are able to open the mouth, the patient is still conscious. Only thing the gag reflexes and he cannot able to respond, the eyes he cannot able to open. So this all we should not come to a conclusion that patient is already unconscious. So the conscious never should be obtained. So procedures like laryngoscopy and intubation, see which be stimulating the adrenergic nervous system, stress response. So we have to in addition avoid this also. So we have to select an induction agent, which will be both making him unconscious as well as give pain. In that aspect, it is a normotension patient, hemodynamically stable. We can go for either ketamine, which is having both the properties of analgesia plus anesthetic, or we can go for propofol plus fentanyl. Propofol as such will not give any analgesic effect. Fentanyl will be taking over the analgesic part, so this can be given as an induction agent. So number 2 is the ventilation. See, once you are opening the airway, clearing the airway, then there will be respiratory depression. See, most often it is the muscle paralysis occurs in the order from head to down. So it starts from the eyeballs, the ptosis, then eyeball, then it comes to the mouth, then chest. Intercostal muscles will be blocked before the diaphragm. So the diaphragm will be still acting. So the type of respiration we can encounter is an abdominal type. The ventilatory excursions may not be adequate. That is why the oxygen saturation on room air was 80. So we have to assist the ventilation because we cannot just keep an oxygen mask and he cannot able to inhale the oxygen we are administering. So this can be done by bag mask ventilation. During the bag mask ventilation, again we have to take care about the pouring of secretion, aspiration, everything. So all these things should be quickly planned and quickly done. So the rapid sequence intubation will be there. So administration.
Paralytics will be.
Paralytic is also because this is only partially paralyzed. So the neurotoxic, usually there are 2 different types of paralysis may occur, either presynaptic or postsynaptic. See, mostly here it is a postsynaptic. See, all the acetylcholine receptors will be attached with the snake venom. So then we have to give the muscle relaxant in the lower dosages. In such cases, non-depolarizing muscle relaxant is a better choice. So better is in the short-acting muscle relaxants like atracorium or cisatracorium or even rocuronium, because it's a faster onset of action we can choose, avoiding the sexual therapy.
And regarding ventilator strategies, anything specific or general principles will apply here also?
So they all will be applied. This is only a neurotoxic causing paralysis. It's not a hematotoxic causing any hemorrhage in the alveolar side, alveolar capillary membrane hemorrhage, nothing is there, and there is no shock or hypotension. So we can go for this one. And when we are repeating the dosage of the muscle relaxant and sedative, the dosages can be tapered or in a reduced dose, because we may like to periodically assess the patient. So in addition, we may be giving neostigmine. So this itself may be causing increased secretions in the salivary. So this also this can be combated by SARS-12, atropine or glycopyrrolate. If there is no bradycardia, we can go for glycopyrrolate. If there is associated profound bradycardia, then atropine will be a better choice.
Great insights. Now on we will be expanding the discussion to more broader aspects of snake bite management per se. Krishna, usually we go for this 20-minute WBCT as a diagnostic tool. But of late, in centers with PTINR, where the facility is there, what is your take on comparison between both?
Okay. So as we see, the 20 minutes WBCT is a standard recommended by the WHO, and all the standard guidelines go with 20 minute WBCT. Because why it is that it is easily available and can be easily run at any center with minimum facility. Only thing that we need is a clean glass container, and we need to keep in fresh blood undisturbed for 20 minutes. A 2 to 3 ml of blood undisturbed for 20 minutes. So then we will get a clue whether the patient has already gone for a DIC. So for WBC to become positive, we need to wait 20 minutes. So if the 20 minutes WBCT is positive, nearly 50% of the coagulation factors are already deranged. So when we think about PTINR, you see we have extrinsic pathway and intrinsic pathway. When we go with PTINR, it actually we can know better that in a way that even if 20% of the clotting factors are deranged, the PTINR will start getting elevated. So much early we can pick up when you are using a PTINR. 20 minutes WBCT is very good. When for a center where we have facility for PTINR, it might be a better choice.
You have your own experience to share?
So what we had with our experience is that whenever we see that initially 20 minutes WBCT was negative, but we still went ahead with doing PTINR very frequently, maybe second hourly or fourth hourly. So we see what we have experienced is that by the time the WBCT is getting prolonged, before that itself the PTINR have started prolonging. So by seeing that itself, we can start the treatment with anti-snake venom. That is what especially for hemotoxic environment.
Any other inputs on this?
Same thing, what Sri Krishna has told, same. PTINR elevates much earlier than 20 minutes whole blood clotting rate. But WHO has clearly said that 20 minutes is the standard test. Why this? Because they are taking the larger population, larger, like not only India. There are a lot of countries where PTINR facility is not available. So we cannot depend on your simple BTCT. So 20 minutes is more reliable than the conventional original methods. But PTINR is always better. But facilities may not be there in everywhere, and standardization of PTINR in various labs are a big problem. That is also there.
Yeah, I agree with the emergency medicine specialists.
And we have PTINR in our emergency room. That's an advantage for us. Immediately
Yeah, point of care.
So
next question is to you, sir. So in our country, we follow more like what is available as a polyvalent antivenom. So, but there are certain places where they go for a monovalent. So what's the real bottleneck in us developing a monovalent antivenom? And also, is there any real superiority for a monovalent antivenom?
Your question is very pertinent, very relevant, but requires a little bit of time to explain. Number one, why the situation is like this in India, where we have a polyvalent antivenom, and why there are some countries which prefer monovalent antivenom. Outright, I can say monovalent antivenom is definitely superior to polyvalent because it is very potent. You are having no mixture. You are having one antivenom directed at one particular species of snake. So no question, more superior. The problem in India is we have so many species of snakes. Countries like, for instance, Australia, where they have monovalent antivenom, though the potency of venomous snakes is very high, the number of species is much less. We have about 300 species, of which about 50 are venomous. A fraction of that only is seen in Australia. So it makes financial sense to go for monovalent antivenom with regard to those snakes, maybe 3 or 4, which are very frequently seen in snake bite cases. Now in India, the problem is finances, number one. If you have monovalent antivenom, then you have to identify which part of the country, which snake is common. That itself is a huge exercise. And suppose, for instance, in Kerala, we have Russell's viper as one of the predominant snakes, and you have a monovalent antivenom for Russell's viper. There are instances where other snake bites will come to the same hospital. Maybe Sawscale viper, maybe hump-nosed pit viper, maybe crate, maybe cobra. So can you now imagine how many kinds of monovalent antivenom we'll have to stop. Then we have to find out whether it is a particular species of snake involved. We have to be 100% sure, then give that particular antivenom. We don't have facility for immunological testing and confirmation that this particular species involved. Lots of problems. So in order to overcome all that, a simplification is to mix antivenom of the commonest venomous snakes of India, and regardless of what kind of snake has bitten, take a chance and give the antivenom. And much of the time it works, even though the potency is less. Now, what the WHO is contemplating is, I may mention at the risk of sounding immodest, that I myself said this in a conference in Indonesia on antivenom, problems. I said that India has this problem. We have polyvalent antivenom, and sometimes, because of the efficacy problems, we are not finding it very useful. So instead of monovalent antivenom, can we have some kind of antivenom of snakes with, say, hemotoxic manifestations, and a separate antivenom for neurotoxic manifestations? We can divide the number of species. Like, for instance, hemotoxic means we need to have antivenom of Sawscale viper and Russell's viper, 2 antivenoms in one mixture. Definitely potency will be more than a polyvalent antivenom with 4 as a mixture. And then the second type of antivenom can be neurotoxic snakes, that is crate and cobra mainly. But then if you talk of cobra, maybe you may have to add king cobra, and if you talk of crate, maybe you'll have to add, in addition to common crate, banded crate also. Even if that is so, doesn't matter, we will have a mixture of, say, 3 antivenoms there. So have 2 kinds of antivenom. And much of the time, in a particular region, it will be either one group, that is hemotoxic snakes predominantly present, or the other group, that is neurotoxic. So we have, instead of 4 different kinds of antivenom, which is financially not very viable, have 2 different types of antivenom. One for hemotoxic snakes with maybe 2 antivenoms mixed into it, and one for neurotoxic snakes with 3 antivenoms mixed into it. So this has been approved by the WHO. Antivenom manufacturers have been told to look into this, and they are looking into it. We hope. Yes, and we hope that very soon we will have this as a reality. We hope so.
Any other insights on this? I think yes, authoritatively commented on it. So, just extending the discussion regarding venoms again, sir. So do you think, say let's say a viper, Russell's viper from our part of the country, and probably is the same species from a northern part of the country, could there be any difference in the venom composition or anything like that? Is it something which is of any relevance? There are thoughts like this, but is there any relevance?
Absolutely, because there are even intra-species variations, and that we are seeing in India. And Sri Lankan, snakebite investigators have been pointing it out for a long time. Even though Sri Lanka is not very far from Tamil Nadu or Kerala, the same species we are talking about, Russell's viper, for instance, they encounter it quite commonly. But the kind of potency that we expect from the antivenom and we get in India, they are not getting, which is probably because of this intra-species variation in the antivenom. The species may be the same, but there can be some sort of genetic, variability, which makes differences in the potency of the antivenom of the same species of snake in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. So it's always better to develop antivenom, I think, region specific. And even in India, I feel, though much of the antivenom is being produced in one particular part of the country, because the venom is extracted from snakes there, I think it should be decentralized, and we should have facility for extraction of venom from snakes, same species across the country, and antivenom to the different kinds of things should be pooled in the same polyvalent antivenom to make it a little bit more effective.
Any other thoughts from you on this? We'll move on to the next question. So, regarding the management perspective, in our part we find a lot of hub-nosed pit vipers. So usually the anti-snake venom may not be that effective against it. So is there any specific manifestations or how will we manage such cases if we can just throw some
But
light?
we have a lot of cases, especially from Palakkad and all, we are getting some nose pit viper. Calicut is there, Wayanad we have. So what is the problem is most of these major four snakes, they respond to ASV. But in hum nose pit viper, the main problem is prolonged renal failure. So once you get a patient who is having viper bite and the patient is having renal failure, which is not resolved immediately within 1 or 2 weeks, you would always think about hum nose pit viper. But this ASV, what we are getting is polyvalent ASV has got some action against this hum nose pit viper, but not, it will not completely cover the hum nose pit viper's venom. There is one disadvantage. So patient who is having prolonged renal failure, which may require multiple sessions of dialysis, maybe 2 months, 3 months, then we have to strongly suspect hum nose pit viper. But at present we do not have any, like sir told, any specific ASV for hum nose pit viper. That is a disadvantage.
Right. Sir, usually what are the key aspects we need to keep in mind in pain management in snake bites, sir?
Sir, one is during the intubation time, rapid sequence syndrome or other things. Number two, maintaining the patient on intubated position and keeping the patient quiet time. So even though we are knocking down the conscious, still the stress responses will be there. Number three, this some of the snake bites may be causing compartment syndrome and mutilated wounds also. In these two cases, the pain management comes into play. So as far as the snake bite is concerned, better we go for the paracetamol alone, avoiding the NSAIDs, because many of this time we come across the renal dysfunction and failure too. So simple. Or the other choice may be tramadol. These are all the things. And morphine, methadone, they usually say we have to avoid because prolonged action, assessment of the patient response for treatment will be very difficult. So what they mostly recommend is only paracetamol.
I'll leave this as an open question. Regarding the dosage, what is kind of the maximum dosage you can use? Anybody can?
So when we were PGs, we used to give 100 vials. Later we came to know that many guidelines is saying only 30 vials or 20 vials are required. Now in our practice we are getting that knowledge that 20 vials may be enough. Most of the bites, 20 to 30 is enough. And we have other options also. If the patient is having respiratory paralysis, we have neostigmine, you have advanced ventilators, all these things are there. Maybe that is also a reason. When we were PGs, we used to give that, maybe that time guidelines was like that. We used to give ASV simply because patient is not improving from the ventilator. That was a reason. Maybe that time we used to give more ASVs. Like sir told, now it is very difficult to get the ASV. Sometimes we are not getting. So now we have to restrict the use.
I think in 2005 Toxicon we had a consensus on regarding the usage of
Yes.
ASV, and we have come to an
Absolutely.
conclusion regarding the maximum dosage.
Yes.
Maybe you can just provide some insight on
Yeah. Actually, we had this national snake bite conference. I think in 2006, perhaps.
2006,
That was the first conference that we dedicated to a particular theme. That is snake bite. We had the support of World Health Organization also. Several experts came from across the country, and I think one or two from abroad also. And we evolved these guidelines on the basis of discussions, by people who are actually treating snake bite cases and other researchers who are not involved in clinical management but involved with snake, venom research. There was a lot of discussion, and the consensus was the optimum anti-snake venom to be given usually is about, as Dr. Lee said rightly, 15 to 20 vials. It should be enough. But a maximum of 30 is what is recommended, because beyond that it is useless. Even the most potent, snake of India, venomous snake, 30 vials will take care of it. And if it doesn't, it means that it has gone into complications. And the venom is now already fixed in tissues, and the more anti-venom you give, you're just wasting it. It is not going to make any difference. So I think that totally.
And it is very important to give whatever you decide to give 20 vials, give the 20 vials first hours itself. Don't wait for next day, third day. Many physicians even give TID, QID doses of ASV. That is not correct.
Yes.
Because this, if we understand the pathology, we will understand. There is a venom, there is an antibody. Once it fixes antibody, that antibody antigen complex forms, then there is no point in giving our ASV.
Absolutely.
That will be neutralized.
Yes.
Or it will be absolutely useless. So whatever we want to give, we have to give first itself.
In this connection, if I may mention, in one conference abroad, where somebody from one country, I will not mention the country, stood up and asked, the experts on the dais. I was not one of the experts, I was among the audience only. The experts on the dais saying that I had this case of snake bite. It was so severe, we gave up to 150 vials, still the patient died. And the expert, one of the experts on the dais said, I think he died because of that, not in spite of it.
And so many other reasons for death in snake bite can occur, like pulmonary embolism can occur,
Yes.
because patient is lying down for many days. That is, maybe he can even die because of acute MI. We had a case of acute MI after snake bite. We had published that paper. So many reasons
Yes.
for death is there, not
Absolutely.
because of which is like ASV is not working. There are a lot of other reasons, like you told, maybe overdose of ASV also can kill the person.
You must have been joking, but he gave a very powerful message.
Correct.
That you should not give ASV indiscriminately and indefinitely. There should be a cut-off point. Number one, as I said, not efficacious beyond a certain point. Number two, you're wasting crucial antivenom, which may be so useful to somebody else.
So, no question to you, sir. Something which has been discussed in our media of late and a lot of controversies. Using snake to kill somebody, using it as a homicidal kind of agent. So, if you can just brief us on the medical legal aspects of such a thing and your views on that.
Yes, it is always known that something like anti-venom, something like a venom of a venomous creature, like a snake, is a potent homicidal weapon. If somebody has got that idea, that he can pass off a particular case of murder as a snake bite, it is always been possible, and we do not know how many cases may have, happened and nobody discovered. This is one case which has, been found out that probably because it was a repeat kind of thing. Already, he attempted this man, the case which is going on in Kerala, and he failed and subsequently tried again. So there is a kind of a suspicion now aroused as to how the same victim can be bitten twice in suspicious circumstances, and they investigated and found that this is the reason. So yes, something like snake venom or venom of some venomous creature being injected or having the creature bite the victim when the victim is helpless or incapacitated is always a possibility.
It is better to make MLC in all types of bites.
Absolutely. For another reason also, because some of the states in India offer compensation for a snake bite victim. So when it is proved that it is snake bite, you should be very clear that you write the certificate like
Forest
that.
department will give.
And yes, compensation will be given to the related. So always, for that you have to make it a medical legal case. Autopsy may have to be done. All those kinds of things.
Any more inputs on anything we have discussed? So we'll conclude. So I'm sure that we cannot discuss all aspects of snake bite in such a short span, but I'm sure we presented a very interesting case with a key message, and also discuss certain relevant topics or certain controversial aspects also in the management of snake bite. Thank you.